Thank you very much and welcome back to the second panel of today. I'm very happy to see again a really great panel of participants and Angela, of course, we already know from the first panel, then Dr. Dhakal, Kai and Eileen. Thank you all for being here, for taking the time to travel all the way to Sri Lanka also. In some cases further away than in other cases, but definitely it's really great to have all of you here. So the second panel will discuss some of the same topics that we discussed in the first one, but with a focus on what are the good approaches, what is working, what are best practices to access finance for climate resilience, for loss and damage, for disaster response, and what are also the roles of the different actors. Beyond the funds, we have talked a lot about the funds, and we'll talk a bit more about the FRLD, but also going beyond that, what is the role of the private sector, how can we have public-private partnerships, how can the funds and these other funding mechanisms complement each other? Also, what are the specific roles and what are the niches that they each have? So maybe to start us off, I would ask Kai the first question to kind of move us away from the funds before we come then back to the funds. Could you share some example of disaster risk financing mechanisms that have worked well in developing country context, of course, and highlight some of the key lessons learned, like why have they worked well and what can we learn from this going forward? Over to you.
Thank you very much, Dennis, and yeah, thank you very much for having me. As I said earlier, my name is Kai. I represent Celsius Pro. We're an insurtech company from Switzerland, and most of our work is centered around designing disaster risk financing programs and products. And we also manage a larger public-private partnership in collaboration with German Development Bank, KfW, on behalf of the German government, on behalf of FCDO for the British government, and Hannover Re, a larger reinsurance company. I can say a few words about that in a second. When I first saw the question, I kind of wondered which of the many examples to pick from, actually, because there's quite a few. But I'd like to go for a more recent one that I think we all saw in the news. And that is the example of the Jamaican government and the country of Jamaica, who have last year as well experienced a major catastrophe, one of the largest hurricanes ever observed in the Atlantic Basin, the largest hurricane to ever make landfall on the Jamaican landmass, Hurricane Melissa. The total losses of Hurricane Melissa are currently estimated to about $10 billion US, and it's only the kind of rapid assessment, so that it doesn't factor in kind of long-term economic impacts of such a disaster. But at the same time, Jamaica is probably the country in the Caribbean with the most advanced and most sophisticated disaster risk financing strategy. So they have a very nicely layered strategy that combines different risk financing tools that are already available to them, which starts with different kind of credit or debt instruments that the government was able to activate in response to Hurricane Melissa. Among that, a contingent credit facility from the Inter-American Development Bank, is a so-called catastrophe deferred drawdown option from the World Bank, which is a pre-agreed credit line. They had several sovereign insurance policies that paid out immediately into the country's balance sheet, with the Caribbean Catastrophe Risk Insurance Facility, CRIF. And they had also placed a so-called catastrophe bond in collaboration with the World Bank that allowed them to access capital markets for their risk financing. And all those instruments together, within the first month after landfall of Hurricane Melissa, paid out about $1 billion US to the Jamaican government, which was readily available for the government to respond to the disaster of Hurricane Melissa. Now, obviously, that strategy is a result of a very, very long-term exercise that the Jamaican government was going through in collaboration with the development partners and the private sector. And it's also not only reflected at the macro level that I've spoken about, that the government is kind of accessing funds, it's also reflected on the more micro level. So over the years, the Jamaican government has also committed to establishing a very enabling insurance regulation in country. So they've been working on microinsurance regulation. They've been working on more enabling regulation for innovative insurance products such as parametric insurance. And as a result of that, a much larger portion of the losses that incurred in country were insured. And I think that's definitely one of the lessons that I'd like to highlight, that it takes kind of long-term commitment on working on these kind of regulations and fiscal instruments that are already available. And also that there's already a toolbox of instruments that is available to governments. So obviously we've spent quite some time speaking about the Fund for Responding to Loss and Damage, which is going to be a significant addition to this toolbox. But there's also a range of tools that is already available from development banks, both kind of at the regional and global level, but also from capital markets and the insurance industry. Another element that I'd like to highlight on kind of how these things can work is on the other side of the kind of money flow, because we very often now in this discussion focus on what we in our sector call the money in side of the equation. This is how do you get funds into the government, into the country when responding to a disaster. But what is also and equally important is the money out side of the equation. How do you get the money from the government or the institutions to the people who actually need the cash or goods or whatever is needed to respond to a disaster? And there we have over the last few years worked on a series of very interesting projects. And I'd like to highlight one of them that we've worked on in India, in the state of Gujarat, in collaboration with the Mahila Housing Trust. Mahila Housing Trust is a housing fund that focuses in particular on female urban workers in the, different cities in Gujarat and also other states. And in this project, we've worked out a heat insurance product. Very often when you think about heat insurance, you think about health impacts. This product goes a little bit beyond that, because throughout the project we realized that heat impacts go much further than only health impacts, because especially these female urban workers are very exposed to heat in their daily work. And very often when there's a heat wave, they face the decision to either work and expose their health or stop working and sacrificing their incomes. So this heat insurance product compensates these women for every day of foregone income during a heat wave. And it's a very nicely integrated solution. So through Mahila Housing Trust, we were able to set up a payout mechanism that uses credit cooperatives that these women are members of, because very often they lack formal bank accounts, which is a formal requirement in India to be able to sign an insurance policy. And in parallel to that, my colleagues from Mahila Housing Trust work on increasing their resilience on other ends, on the adaptation side of the equation, using very pragmatic approaches, as in kind of white paint for the roofs to reflect more heat, cooling stops in informal settlements, etc. So it's a very nicely integrated project that combines adaptation, microfinance, and insurance. Yeah, and I think that's also my bottom line to this question. Like, these efforts have to go hand in hand. Both the kind of regulatory, fiscal, disaster risk finance planning, but also the kind of private sector enabled combination of adaptation, resilience building, and risk financing.
Thank you very much. I think that's really interesting to kind of see the broad range set of mechanisms that are there and that are already in many cases, of course, tested and tried while the FRLD is emerging. So there's all the things that we can look at on how to kind of build on some of these learnings, perhaps. Dr. Maheshwar, I would like to kind of seamlessly go forward. As this loss and damage finance landscape evolves under the UNFCCC and also more broadly, how do you think the role of the FRLD and maybe also other UNFCCC arrangements is in complementing the existing tools and initiatives that are there? And also, what do you think are like the key value that the FRLD brings to countries such as Sri Lanka as a board member and also as someone from the region who knows the context very well?
Thank you, Dennis and esteemed panelists. And first of all, I would like to share my sincere thanks to the organizing for inviting me to speak in this important forum. I think in earlier panel, in the previous sessions, we discussed a lot and how do you access the climate finance nationally and internationally as a multilateral approach. But for me, as you are asking more straightforward with the FRLD and its access approaches, I think, every country, the situation of loss and damage or climate change impacts is totally different. You cannot compare from Colombo to Kathmandu. I am coming from the mountainous country, and my country, the loss and damage is totally different. As once the climate change, the temperature rise is initiated, and it starts from the glacier melting and Gulf and all the cascading effects in the downstream, unlike in the coastal approach here in Sri Lanka. That's why, in my opinion, sometimes what I am asking in my speaking or in my team, that how do we can connect coastal country and mountainous country and glacier melting and sea level rise, two slow onset, two different areas. It's a multilateral and more regional approach sometimes we can develop. But particularly regarding to the climate finance and the FRLD, what you are asking to me, I think first and foremost, we need a very critical analysis of the gap. Whatever resources already you do have and how much money you need to address that loss and damage. That type of very, unlike conventional or as usual business scenario, what you are doing every year, we need a very additional and more critical analysis of the financial gap assessment. But before that, you need an inventory of the loss and damage, and the critical risk assessment part is there, the technical part. And then second is, what type of climate finance strategy is your country is adopted? I read some papers that the Sri Lankan government has recently adopted a new climate finance strategies. It's very, very important, right? Climate change is a global and cross-cutting agenda, and every element of the society, even all ministries and even national, subnational and local levels, all partners equally need to be contribute as a global, is a cross-cutting and equally impacted to all the peoples. That's why coherence among the government policies is very, very important, because you cannot manage the loss and damage in silos, and you need interconnected and respect and reciprocal each other among the entities. And at the same time, sometimes, many people, even I'm from the least developed country, Nepal, mountainous country, landlocked country, and even I used to say one of the most vulnerable country in the globe. If you see all the incidents, all the loss, and definitely the Nepal is one of the most impacted country. But at the same time, international climate finance is just only supportive part. The first and foremost part is what type of strategy and what type of preparedness you are doing by yourself. Because the local government is there, local communities are there, private sector are there, and how you are doing that internally very confidence and very robust modality in terms of policy and institutional preparedness we have to develop in our own country. On the other hand, climate change and loss and damage is highly related to the justice part, climate justice. Because unlike the mitigation and adaptation, simply what we used to talk in daily day-to-day business, loss and damage is more related to the most vulnerable people, women, children, and indigenous peoples. Even nowadays, even if you go to the rural areas, most of the senior citizens, they are living there. And can you imagine how impacted they are from the slow onset, side-by-side, rapid onset? That's why climate justice part in loss and damage is very, very important. That's why you have to interconnect and you have to give the highest priority over there. And another part is very, very important. In the previous sessions, some of the colleagues are asking which methodology or how do you define whether this loss and damage is really climate induced or not. That's very important. How do you justify the climate attributes? That's why you need a robust database system, research and planning, so that you can say this is the climate induced disaster, is a part of climate justice, and we need a funding. In summary, if you are accessing the maximum level of climate finance, then first do the assessment, both loss and damage risk assessment and financial gap, and please find your own strategy, how you are implementing those and developing the complementarities and then coherence among the other resources, and then definitely mobilize all the element of the society, whole of the government and whole of the society approach to make the best results, best practices. And then as I give the special focus on the justice part, most vulnerable communities, the poor and marginalized communities who are living very far from the city center and never they have the access to the public resources. And then finally, the climate science and database systems. These are some elements that we really need to work and build the capacity to the developing countries, to the coastal countries like Sri Lanka. Thank you very much. Dennis, over to you.
Thank you very much. I think these are all really important points, and thank you also for highlighting the question of climate justice and how it is intricately connected with loss and damage. And I think this also connects to what Kai was saying on the money out aspect of it. Like once the money is at the country level, how do we make sure it especially reaches those most vulnerable communities and groups? And also how can we build the requirements and the preconditions at that level for them to access money and to kind of benefit from these mechanisms, both the FRLD but also insurance, for example. Maybe now to Eileen. What do you think from your experience as a government person, as an expert in the UNFCCC, what are the existing global initiatives and platforms that offer concrete opportunities for countries such as Sri Lanka to access finance for disaster response and for resilience? And how can countries better engage with these mechanisms and platforms?
Okay. First of all, thank you very much for inviting me to this panel. It's a great pleasure to be here in Colombo. And also, I would also like to extend my sympathy and condolences to the people of Sri Lanka for the devastation caused by the recent cyclonic storm. Yeah. So on your question, there are, I think climate resilience and disaster response entails a range of responses or preparatory work. So first of all, it starts with building resilience. And to do this, there are a number of funds and funding opportunities that are available out there, beginning with the operating entities of the financial mechanism of the UNFCCC, such as the GCF, the Adaptation Fund, and the JEF. Yeah, we have heard a lot this morning from the representatives of these institutions. And there are a number of things that you can do initially to minimize the impact of disasters, so that it also helps to become more insurable for future disasters if you are able to proactively prepare in advance for such scenarios by building the resilience. So you can do things like build infrastructure resilience, build livelihood resilience, or even strengthen early warning systems. Yeah, there is a host of things that you can do, or even like build, strengthen the natural capital. And then another category of support would be post-disaster response. And then again, there are a number of initiatives that support post-disaster response, and funds that may immediately come to mind would be, I guess, the UN OCHA, the SURF, Central Emergency Response Fund, and also then there is the IFRC Disaster Response Fund. And as mentioned by Kai, there are also rapid response facilities under the World Bank, and also the ADB, which would support, I mean, if Sri Lanka would be eligible for. And there are also regional risk insurance facilities, but I'm not sure if there's anything directly applicable to the South Asia region. So this might be a takeaway actually from the workshop that we might need to work on, because as Kai was saying, that Jamaica was immediately able to benefit from the Caribbean regional facility. And there are similar facilities in the Pacific, even in the Africa region. So yeah, what else? Then there are, another area would be reconstruction. And for this, it's usually the MDBs, like the World Bank, the AIIB, ADB. And also there are sectoral funds like IFAD for rebuilding agriculture, or yeah, agriculture. And then UNESCO for non-economic losses like heritage protection. And yeah, there are so many options out there. But I guess the main concern, or the main issue, despite this diverse range of funding opportunities out there, is that what's available in these pots is very little compared to the scale of needs. And for example, I was going through what happened in Pakistan in 2022. So following this disaster, the Pakistani government estimated that they needed like $16 billion in support for their post-disaster recovery efforts. But in the end, they only received 600 million, which is, yeah, very little compared to their actual needs. So definitely this means that public funding is not enough. So building partnerships becomes very critical, and I think it's the point of the topic here today. And to build partnerships, you would need to do your own preparatory work at the national level, I guess. And we have heard from other panelists here about the need to strengthen coordination at the national level, make sure that those who are actually affected on the ground are included and able to have a say in these processes, so that the resources we have are most effectively used. And also, we need to ensure that there is no duplication of effort, so that yeah, we increase the efficiency of what is being done. Besides that, I also agree that in order to be prepared to access the funding, we need data, including very local level data, because usually we need to justify the climate rationale, or like was discussed earlier today, we need to give a baseline scenario to show that the impact was due to, for example, this extreme event, and now we need to recover from this. So I think how we can go about this is to strengthen cooperation with the local academia, or even use new technologies available for citizen-based science apps, for example, to get ordinary people who are really experiencing. Maybe I can relate from the Maldives, like, for example, we have people scattered around a large number of islands with very few people living in some islands. So it's really not cost effective to set up research institutions in these places to gather primary data. But then through citizen-based apps, regular people can monitor their coastal changes and enter the data into these systems. So things like that are opportunities. And then another way could be like to have training programs on capacity building for proposal development, so that and strengthening civil society for that, so that whenever there is opportunity for accessing funding out there, you are consistently able to produce very high quality proposals that have a high chance of getting success. So yeah, to recap, there is a lot of opportunity out there, but the gap between the needs and what is available is very wide. So we need to figure out ways to strengthen the effectiveness and efficiency of whatever we are getting. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you. And I think it kind of complements what the previous panelists have said also. That's why, for example, a national financing strategy is so important, because there are so many different windows and there are so many different opportunities, and to kind of have a coherent approach to accessing funding and support from these different entities and institutions. I think it's really important to have this coherence and avoid duplication, but also to build these capacities to consistently be able to produce proposals and have this supported by the national, the necessary data infrastructure. So maybe, Angela, to build on this, from your experience, what would be like some practical recommendations to actually to have a coherent approach at the national level to disaster response and to financing, to get the house in order, so to say? What would you recommend?
Thank you so much, and I think that's an important question, and I like the way how you frame it in organize your house, you know? That's the main issue that we have in our country. Organize which is responsible for what, you know? And usually the main challenges that we face is we have everybody on board on everything, but when we need to take action, the institutions say it's not my responsibility. You know, that's a common practice in our countries or in developing countries. And I think one of the areas that we need to work on it, or that Colombia is doing, for instance, is to establish a body, a national body. We did it for the GCF, and now we are doing for the Loss and Damage Fund. So we established, let's say, yeah, I'm going to call it a body because I don't know how to call it in another way. But we have, let's say, 4 institutions that are working on climate change, or we have the Ministry of Environment, for sure. We have the Department of Planning. I don't know if you have a Department of Planning, but something similar, for sure you have it. The Finance Ministry and the Risk Unit. They form this like body that we work in terms of approving the proposals for the Loss and Damage Fund. And it's also the same body for the GCF. There is a, let's say, like a presidency of this body, or like a secretary. And they rotate the presidency between the Ministry of Environment and the Department of Planning. It was really difficult to reach this agreement because everybody, you know, when there is money behind, so all entities would like to take the lead on the process. But we need to understand that this is a collective work. It's not that I want to get the resources for the Ministry of Environment or for the Department of Planning. This is a collective work to tackle climate change in the country. And the climate change is a problem not just for one sector. Climate change is not only environment. Climate change is also agriculture. It's also health. It's also global heritage. So you need to involve all sectors in the climate change activities. So in the Loss and Damage Fund, we have, let's say, an obligation, like in the GCF, to identify a focal point for the Loss and Damage Fund. And it's an invitation that I want to make to you, to the government and the institutions here from Sri Lanka. if you want to get access to the loss and damage fund, the first thing that you need to do is to identify what is the focal point. But it doesn't mean that the focal point will be working alone. So you need to create some kind of coordination mechanism at national level that allow you to involve all the institutions that are working on loss and damage issues. Otherwise, if the focal point is working alone, perhaps we're gonna lose the opportunity to identify the main priorities of the country. So that's why, for instance, in Colombia, we decide not only to engage the Ministry of Environment, because a Ministry of Environment is in charge of the loss and damage negotiations, but also to engage other institutions like the planning and the Ministry of Finance, because the resources are gonna go to the Ministry of Finance. We are pushing for having direct access, since we mentioned in the previous panel. So I think the first thing is to identify, what is the mechanism of coordination in your country, to identify the focal point. So the focal point is like the entity or the person that is gonna submit the request to the loss and damage fund. But again, that kind of work is not only in the hands of one institution. You need to coordinate with other entities like the risk management institution or the presidency, or, it's up to you because you know how you're working. But without that mechanism in place, you can fail in terms of the identification of your priorities. When you communicate this body, then you can start working on the priorities and then apply to the loss and damage fund. So that's the first thing. The other thing is, as we discussed in the previous panel, we have different bodies, this new landscape. So we have the loss and damage fund, which is the money, but we also have the Santiago network. And in the Santiago network, we invite countries to identify loss and damage contact points. And I have to confess that negotiators, we are very creative. Because to me, the loss and damage contact point should be the main focal point for the loss and damage fund. But we decide to differentiate. And it's up to the country if you want to differentiate or not. In my case, at least, I'm promoting just to have one focal point, contact point, authority working with those bodies. Why? Because it's the loss and damage landscape. And if you apply to the Santiago network for technical assistance, and then you apply for the loss and damage fund, there should be some kind of coherence in terms of the application. You need to know what are you doing with each of the bodies. So if you have different entities working on loss and damage, different focal points for everything, there is no coordination, there is no cooperation, unless you have a coordination mechanism. So it's up to the country to identify if you need to have an additional focal point or contact point for the Santiago network, or if you want to use the focal point. But at least the focal point for the loss and damage fund. But at least it's important to establish your mechanism and organize your house. And finally, let me highlight this. I think when you identify your governance, national governance, if I can say, it's important that you ensure, and I think my colleague mentioned that in the past, it's important that you ensure that your planning processes take into account loss and damage landscape. I think, as you know, we have to submit our NDCs. I think most of you did it, and I think Sri Lanka also did it. It's also important that you include loss and damage in your planning processes, in your NDCs. Even if you don't know how to include loss and damage in the NDCs, there is a political signal that increases visibility on this, and also the areas of work that you have in your country with a forward-looking perspective. So I was promoting since the beginning in Colombia and in Latin American countries to include loss and damage in the NDCs, in the planning processes. So when you apply to the loss and damage fund or the Santiago network, you can say, Secretariat, look, I have loss and damage in my NDC. I don't know if it is very well drafted or done, or if the planning is very well done. but at least you are showing that you want to work on that. If you don't have in those instruments, you are showing that perhaps it's not a priority. So you need to have a hook that allow you to bring to the international community into your national processes and get the cooperation that you need. So once you have it in your NDC, in your national adaptation plans, in your planning and processes, is better, and it fits into the international agenda and future cooperation. Thank you.
Thank you. On the
Can
last
I
point,
challenge that a bit?
yeah, sorry.
Can I challenge that a bit?
Yeah, but just to briefly add on the last point, Sri Lanka actually has already loss and damage as a sector in its NDC since the first NDC in 2015, 16. So it's already well on the way to fill the recommendations. But yeah, please challenge.
I'm sorry, but when I hear that, obviously, kind of the perspective you take is kind of very informed by kind of the negotiations, the frameworks. But I mean, what we're ultimately trying to achieve is that the countries can better cope with their risk. And when you kind of take the risk perspective rather than the negotiation perspective, I think what countries need is almost like in the private sector, you would call it a chief risk officer. All right, that's something that every bank has, and we also see it kind of emerging in other sectors. Like initially, it was somewhere in the ESG department that people think about climate risk, and now it's kind of becoming more and more material, and then it's also becoming more and more important. And I mean, if you look at things through the risk lens, then obviously FRLD is one of the potential kind of sources for funding or compensation, or however you want to frame it. But it's next to a much larger existing toolbox that as a country you have already access to. And I think when you look at these tools through kind of the negotiations, then FRLD and then the other tools, it's not necessarily the right sequencing, because let's face it, it's going to take a while until countries have access to these to FRLD kind of funds, and it's super important that they kind of get their house in order to be ready. But as a part of getting your house ready for FRLD, there's also so many other things that you can already do and that you can already access, that from my perspective, I think it's way more important to look at these things through the risk lens rather than being ready on the negotiation side.
Yeah, thank you so much. And I understand, because you came from insurance and I came from negotiations. Yeah, I agree part in terms of your comment. But I have to confess that, I think it's right. There is international responsibility. And this international responsibility is through a legally binding obligation. And there are legally binding obligations in the Paris Agreement and the UNFCCC. And I have to confess that, of course, it doesn't prevent us to look at the other landscapes or the other, and I think Eileen already raised that. There are different mechanisms to get access to the loss and damage finance. There are global shield initiative, risk insurance, and I think all countries, they are working by themselves, because we have to be frank. We are dealing with our own losses and damages. We are not getting sufficient support at international level to deal with the loss and damage that we are facing. And there are not enough resources at international level to deal with it. So it's up to the countries if they want to look at other financial mechanisms. And I know that insurers are there. I know that Global Shield, Instant Resilience, and different kind of initiatives are there. Which mechanism countries should prioritize is up to you, up to them. But I'm here as Santiago Network, as well as a government representative. I was a government representative, that we need to use the mechanisms that we discuss at the international level, that we fought for them. I'm not saying you have to prioritize the loss and damage fund or the Santiago network. It's up to you which one you want to use it. But my main call is because we fought for that mechanism, we need to use it. If we spend 30 years asking for a loss and damage reparation for developed countries to comply with their obligations, and then we decide not to apply to the loss and damage fund or the Santiago network, what we are doing? We are losing the opportunity to use those mechanisms. And we are losing the opportunity to say, look, vote for this. After 30 years, I'm applying for the fund. And developed countries and developed countries to comply with the. If I don't do that, what's the point of speaking about reparations of climate change? So, again, you can decide. But that's why we have multilateralism. That's why we have those treaties. We need to use the international for access to the resources that are needed, but also to ensure that countries are complying with the international obligations. And insurance, of course, we have insurance, and insurance are important. And my main concern also, I'm not an expert on insurance, but in other types of funding arrangements, is that the developing countries we are facing, we are increasing the debt in our countries. And we don't want to fail in having more indebtedness. Latin American countries are the countries who are more in debt for climate change action. And it's not fair with us that we still dealing with climate change by ourselves, because we do not create the problem. So I think this is a collaborative approach, but we need to ensure that those who create the climate change problem respond to the challenges that we are facing in our countries.
Yeah, thank you very much for, to both of you, actually, because I think these are both true and both pieces of the puzzle. Obviously, within the UNFCCC process, we need to access these mechanisms, they need to be used, and of course, there are obligations that countries have, and there is a clear flow where finance should go from and to. But of course, there are also mechanisms outside the UNFCCC that also can benefit countries. And there's some overlap between these also. And I remember, for example, also vaguely the Fiji clearinghouse on risk transfer within the UNFCCC, which also addressed kind of this insurance question to some extent. Let's go to, not to go too deep into this, but when you mentioned this kind of risk framing, I think it's also important to not just look at loss and damage in isolation, right? Because we also need to look at the adaptation piece of the puzzle and the mitigation piece. And especially since ideally countries want to avoid loss and damage, right? So loss and damage should be the last resort. It's very good that there's opportunities to access funding for it. But of course, also we need more adaptation finance and to kind of prevent some of the loss and damage before it happens. So to have a loss and damage coordination at the national level, but that also intersects with the adaptation coordination. I think that would be also really important to have a holistic overall strategy. Just a quick question: in Colombia, this national body on loss and damage, where is it housed? Like, how is it set up? It's like under the president or the prime minister, or it's like a separate entity, or is it in one of the ministries?
So the Ministry of Environment is the one who's dealing with the international negotiations on loss and damage. Some years ago, we decided to divide the direction of climate change into different kind of coordinations. So we have a risk coordination, we have another coordination that is for adaptation, and we have a mitigation coordination. So there is a risk perspective also in our country. But we also have a risk office that depends from the presidency. So they respond when there is an extreme event or something like that. They are involved for the reconstruction, supporting this kind of process. So the Ministry of Environment is in charge of this, but we collaborate with the presidency, with the risk office. And the way that we discuss things is that, we want to ensure that everybody is involved. And that's why we create this kind of body that allow the entities to bring their own perspective. You know, we have the risk management office bringing the risk perspective to the discussion on the projects and priorities, and also we have the Ministry of Environment who's working also in the loss and damage area. And if I just want to mention that or reply to your comment, I think it's very important to keep in our minds that we need to work on mitigation and adaptation, as you said. We are here talking only about loss and damage, but loss and damage is the end of the I mean, is the problem that we are facing now, but we need to adapt. And we also need to create these kind of synergies in all areas. If there is no mitigation, we have to increase our efforts on adaptation. And if we do not do anything on adaptation, we end in more losses and damages. And it's the same at the international level. So we need to ask those who don't mitigate to increase their action on mitigation, and then, you know, the efforts on adaptation will be less, and losses and damages will be less. So I think it's important to have into perspective that we cannot work in silos only on loss and damage. There are areas that are key of climate change in general.
Thank you. I couldn't agree more. And I think this question of coordination, of course, it keeps coming up because it's a hard problem, and everyone likes coordination, but few like to be coordinated, right? So if you talk about coordination, everyone sees themselves in the coordinating role, but of course there has to be like a process where there's an overall coordination where everyone has their part to play. Speaking about everyone having their part to play, maybe we could briefly talk about the private sector and public-private partnerships, where the government can work together with private sector to address these finance gaps for disasters, for climate resilience, and particularly in contexts like Sri Lanka or other developing countries. Maybe Kai, I would give you the floor first, and then maybe Maheshwar and Eileen. And I think that we have to wrap up this panel also.
Okay, I'll try to be quick. And I think just briefly picking up on the discussion, I think I'm definitely not pushing for insurance as a silver bullet here, just to get things straight, right? It's like it has its place in this whole ecosystem next to debt instruments, and insurance is not a debt effective instrument, but obviously you have to pay the premium for it. And grant based on concessional instruments, like potentially the FRLD, they all have to work in conjunction, and they all have their place in the kind of risk chain, or in the risk layering, or in the risk tower. And it's super important to understand and analyze kind of what level of risk fits for, or which tool fits for which level of risk, because there's different tools that are most cost effective in different kind of positions of risk. And that's what every country needs to figure out, right? And something that we work with at Celsius Pro is called the Natural Disaster Fund, which is a risk transfer vehicle. So it's basically a public-private partnership that serves as the function of a reinsurer, a vehicle to provide risk capital to the sovereign risk pools that we talked about earlier, to local insurance companies, to microfinance institutions, to humanitarian organizations. All of these risk aggregators can buy reinsurance capacity at the Natural Disaster Fund, and the fund itself was capitalized by KfW and FCDO. That's something I mentioned earlier. The public capital that sits in the fund is about 70 million euros, and every transaction that we write with the NDF is also matched by risk capacity that comes from Hannover, a commercial player. So that's where the public-private element comes into play. Because we've been working with the fund for quite a few years now. It's in place since 2018, and it's now kind of has slowly delivered its proof of concept. Hannover has recently agreed to double their commitment from 50 to 100 million. So they also increased their leverage on the public financing from 50-50 to 70-30. And since fund inception in 2018, the Natural Disaster Fund has already seen $50 million in insurance payouts to actual disasters, including Hurricane Melissa, for example. But the capital base of the fund is still there because it's a market-based instrument. So we basically put the donor capital to work, and we crowd in private sector investment. Most of the transactions are, after some time, also shared with additional commercial reinsurers. And that's how we build a market case for climate risk insurance in the Global South, because that's actually a big market imperfection. When you do climate risk insurance in Colombia, in Nepal, in the Maldives, as a local insurer, it's very, very, very hard to get access to reinsurance, because for reinsurance firms, it's expensive to do this type of business, which means it's then also expensive for the local insurance companies to get access to that. And with the kind of concessional element of the Natural Disaster Fund, we are able to provide very stable and long-term pricing that is catalytic for these kind of micro-insurance pilots that then slowly grow over time into more market-viable programs. And I think that's a very nice example how a public-private partnership can work. In this case, public capital from donor countries and private capacity that comes from an insurance player from an industrial countries. But it's a partnership that works with 40 different clients in more than 70 countries in the Global South. So it's really, really broad and has really delivered its proof of concept. And we're working on scaling it even further and want to deploy $500 million in risk capacity by 2030.
Thank you very much. Maybe, Maheshwar, if you want to comment on any of the things that were just discussed, rather than asking you a specific question, I think maybe there's so many entry points already that you could comment on. But if you want to talk about the role of the private sector when it comes to loss and damage, that would also be interesting. It's a difficult question, of course.
Yeah. Thank you very much. Yeah, I fully agree with the colleagues because normally in the developing countries, particularly my own countries, the private sector is not very much aware about the loss and damage and climate-induced disaster. Even unlike the different mechanism and coordination, risk assessment, what I'm asking always to our private sector is, how do we can create the more enabling environment for the investment to the private sector with proper risk assessment, and it's really sometimes necessary to build the capacity of the private sector as well, not the most vulnerable people, what we are talking always from the perspective of climate justice and so on. Basically, if you take the reference from my own country, I'm looking some areas are highly productive to create more job and more income and more employment opportunities to those peoples, and the private sector can play a very important role. For example, agriculture and food security is one of the best business, even here in Sri Lanka and my own country and even our neighbor country, India. And private sector can invest with some risk assessment, but there is a huge market. And the forest and biodiversity is another areas what I am looking. And then third one is the clean energy, particularly in Nepal, we are giving the highest priority, as our colleague already said, the NDC, how do you integrate loss and damage and the clean energy with the NDC and the more ambitious target. And even we are proposing for conditional and unconditional target to enabling, create more enabling environment to the private sector. They can invest to those areas. And the fourth and most important area is the nature-based tourism. The loss and damage is, whether you are talking about the ex post or ex ante discussion, this is another part. Economic or non-economic loss and damage is another part. But the question is now, how do you create the enabling environment to the private sector and then make your society more resilient so that no more any loss and damage in the future in the long term? This type of long-term perspective also equally very, very important to motivate the private sectors. This is Dennis, what I would like to say. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Then Eileen, would you also want to comment on the private sector, public-private partnerships, but also if you want to comment on the coordination and how to balance and the different mechanisms and opportunities that are there within and outside the UNFCCC?
Yeah, thank you, Dennis. I think I'll come in very briefly. I also think, given that a private sector is mainly driven by profit motives, I find it a little bit odd that we could attract them to invest in loss and damage. It sounds like fundamentally wrong to me. But as has been mentioned before, with concessional elements, you are actually able to make them viable and develop a business case. So I think developing the necessary enabling environments is very important to build these partnerships. This could be in the form of providing financial incentives or even building the necessary regulatory frameworks to support private sector. Maybe another thing would be to have clear long-term planning and political support with areas for private sector engagement very clearly defined. Yeah, but generally I think it would be a challenging task to attract private finance for this kind of loss and damage. Yeah.
Thank you very much. And I mean, I think that is, when we talk about the private sector and the partnerships, of course, we need to keep in mind that it's like an area that is kind of additional to the obligations that are there, and they should not be replacing this. So if we talk about the FRLD and its role, it's not that the private sector should step up and relieve developed countries of their responsibilities. It's that in addition to funding from the FRLD, which is not sufficient, unfortunately, to address all the needs, that there are other opportunities as well where the private sector can play a role. Insurance companies prominently, but I think also other private sector entities might be important players in this. And even looking at the small scale, looking at local level private sector entrepreneurs, they can also play roles in resilience building, but potentially also responding to impacts. And we had the Ministry of Industries earlier here to talk about impacts on industries. I think also there's a role in terms of relief, reconstruction, all of these things, recovery. So with this, I would like to wrap up this panel since we are already a bit over time, but we also started a bit late with this panel. So thank you all the panelists. Thank you so much for coming here, for sharing your insights. I know you have all traveled from Colombia, from Nepal, from Germany, from Switzerland, sorry, and from Maldives, and we really appreciate you coming here. Thank you so much.